Robert and Michael Meeropol were 10 and 6 years old in 1953. Their last name at the time was Rosenberg. Their parents were Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were executed for treason on June 19, 1953.
With the upcoming presidential election this November, C-SPAN is once again providing middle and high school students across the country with a platform to tell us about the issues that are important to them and their generation. Our 21st annual Student Cam documentary competition is now open to submissions and will award $100,000 in cash prizes to the top 150 videos. For more information, visit studentcam.org.
ABC Thursdays.
Welcome back.
Grey's Anatomy is all new.
Why didn't you tell me you were pregnant?
The drama going down
Bungee jumping from a bridge, his cord snapped.
We need all hands on deck.
is unbelievable.
You think you're God's gift to this hospital?
You're just another doctor.
My relationship with Catherine is complicated.
I'm gonna sue you.
Your lawyers know where to find me.
You're unbelievable.
Grey's Anatomy. All new Thursdays, 10/9 Central on ABC and stream on Hulu.
This was a trial of the century that encased the Cold War, communism, anti-Semitism, and the nuclear bomb. Key players included J. Edgar Hoover, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, Roy Cohn, and Albert Einstein, as well as W.E.B. Du Bois. Robert and Michael join us to talk about their parents' execution, the aftermath, the impact on their lives, and their efforts to find the facts in the case of their parents' execution. Here are the Rosenberg sons.
One of the greatest peacetime spy dramas in the nation's history reaches its climax as Julius Rosenberg and Morton Sobel, convicted of revealing atomic secrets to the Russians, enter the federal building in New York to hear their doom. Another of the spy ring, Mrs. Ethel Rosenberg, who with her husband was convicted of actually transmitting the secrets to Russia through Soviet diplomatic channels. The ring was first uncovered following the arrest of Klaus Fuchs in England. David Greenglass, Mrs. Rosenberg's brother, confessed theft of the secrets while stationed at the Los Alamos atomic project. He later became the government's chief witness in the prosecution of Sobel and the Rosenbergs. It is a stern jurist they face in Judge Irving Kaufman. After administering a tongue lashing in which he charged them with the indirect death of thousands of men in Korea, he sentenced both Rosenbergs to death in the electric chair and Sobel to 30 years in prison.
Michael Meeropol, you were 10 years old on June 19th, 1953. What do you remember about your parents' execution in that day?
I remember it, unfortunately, very, very clearly because I was watching a baseball game and they kept interrupting the baseball game with news. First, that the Supreme Court had vacated a stay of execution. Instead of the execution being delayed for months, it was going to happen that night. And then later, Eisenhower denied clemency. So I watched it it was like I was watching the execution on TV. It was that stark and that horrible.
And do you remember how you felt watching that?
Yeah, I felt that the world was ending. And I did know that my mother had written a mercy letter to Eisenhower. So that evening when I was outside playing catch as the sun went down, I kept hoping the mercy letter would work. And so when I went inside the house, I talked to the adults and I said, "What happened?" And they wouldn't say it to me. They just said, "We listened to every radio station. They all said the same thing." And then I knew.
Robert Meeropol, you were 6. What do you remember about that day?
Well, actually, what I remember is playing ball with my friend outside as it got dark, and the adults all being, very upset. But I learned pretty early that if I pretended I didn't understand what was going on, people didn't fuss over me, and I didn't like fuss. So I just kept my head down and said nothing. And then I went to sleep. And it wasn't until I was young enough as a 6-year-old so that I didn't really, what was death? I didn't really quite understand it. And I think I still had some magical thinking that, well, if I really, really wanted something to happen, I could wish it to happen. So I really can't even tell you when I realized that my parents had been killed. I just knew that something dark and dangerous had happened, and we all had to keep our heads down. And I guess I felt kind of anxious and scared. By the time the year ended, by the time 1953 came to an end, I knew that my parents, I'd never see them again. But I can't tell you exactly when I figured that out.
Now, Robert, let's start with you. You both referred to adults. Who were the adults with you that day?
Well, there were the people, we were living with friends of my parents in Toms River, New Jersey. And the reporters discovered where we were. And so we were whisked away to someone else's house, the house of Emily and Dave Allman, who were the heads of the committee that was working to save my parents' lives. And that's where we were, and those were the adults who were talking. And beyond David and Emily, and I know there were other adults, I guess Ben and Sonia Bach, I don't even really remember that aspect of it.
Michael?
Yeah, there was a kid my age named Steve Levitt, and he and I guess his younger brother were part of the group that were playing catch with Robbie and me as the sun went down.
Michael, you were 7 when your parents were arrested. What are your memories of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg?
Yeah, well, I remember, for example, my mother being pregnant with Robbie and her nursing him after he came home. And I remember, going on Subway and Third Avenue L rides with my father to Prospect Park and to the Bronx Zoo. And there was a playground between the two apartment complexes where we lived. And he would take me there and throw a Spalding ball to me, and I'd use a bat to hit it, or I'd use one of these rackets to hit it. I remember all those kinds of things very, very well.
Robert?
Well, my memory is much weaker. It was slightly after my 3rd birthday when my parents were taken away from us, and so my memories are just of sort of vague sense of a happy home that was no longer. Really, my memories of my parents come from visiting them in prison. If it hadn't been for those prison visits, I'd probably have no clear memories of them. And given that I was, only a little over 6, just past my 6th birthday when they were executed, even my memories of their prison visits are kind of vague. That's, but I'm very grateful for whatever memories I have.
June 19th, 1953 was their execution date. When's the last time you saw them?
Well, just before the execution, we visited them in prison. I can't remember if it was the 16th or the 17th of June. Michael may have a better handle on that, but it was then. And, that's the last time we saw them.
It was June 16th, and the only reason I remember that for sure is that they had been sentenced to die on June 18th, which ironically, disgustingly, was their 14th wedding anniversary. So when we left the prison, rather than the usual smiles and goodbye, see you next time, I knew there was a danger that they would actually be killed on the 18th. So I started sort of whining, one more day to live, one more day to live. And they stopped themselves from crying, kissed us both, and we were gone. So it was the 16th. And then the good news was the next day we discovered that there'd been a last-minute stay of execution, which would keep them alive for months and months. And then, of course, the day after, they called the Supreme Court back into special session, which was an absolutely disgusting activity. And then the day after that, they were killed. So they got one extra day of life instead of extra months of life that would have been under the normal procedures.
What were your parents' professions?
Mom was initially a secretary in an industrial plant, and she did work in other contexts as a secretary. She was a very good typist. And then she was a full-time homemaker, I think, from the time I was born. Dad was an electrical engineer. He worked for the United States government during World War II. And then after the war, he set up a small machine shop with family members, and he owned it. It was a business that was not doing very well, but that was his profession after World War II.
And where were you living when they were arrested in 1950?
Well, we were living in Knickerbocker Village, which is in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, near the Manhattan terminus of the Manhattan Bridge. And, you know, I also want to add that one of the things that I've learned about my mother, more recently gotten a better understanding of, is that she had a very bad back. She was bedridden at least some of the time while raising me and Michael. And I think this bad back must have pained her throughout the rest of her life. A lot of the pictures that you see of her, particularly in the court, is she has this sort of grim, straight-lined expression on her face. And given my own back troubles that I think I inherited from her, my inference from that is that she was dealing with a fair amount of pain during that time, though she didn't reveal it.
Mm.
What were they charged with when they were arrested?
Glad you asked that question, because in the public's mind, I think they are known as traitors. And the judge even used that word in the sentencing speech. But they were charged with conspiracy to commit espionage, which meant under federal law, they didn't even have to prove that they did anything other than agree to commit the crime. And that is a very low bar for a prosecution to clear with a jury.
Do you have?
Yeah, and
go ahead.
That is what's sort of interesting about that is the newsreel that you played at the beginning of the program got it wrong. They said they were convicted of transmitting atomic secrets. That's actually not the case. But that's and conspiracy is really, as my brother said, is very easy to prove if you basically charge someone with conspiracy. They're involved in the conspiracy if they take one act in furtherance of the conspiracy. And that's how my mother became involved. And that's why, I feel like for your viewers, this is an exciting time to be talking about the Rosenberg case, because I think we're on the verge of a breakthrough with my mother's case. And I understand we'll get to that in the talk. But I want your viewers to know that this is just not an ordinary time in a case that is now approaching 75 years old.
How long were you in Los Alamos, New Mexico?
We never were there, and neither were our parents. It was David Greenglass, my mother's brother, who was an Army machinist, who was sent there and was stationed there. And according to the prosecution, they claimed that my parents set in motion a conspiracy that allowed them, through David Greenglass, and now I'll use the terms that the case is known for, to steal the secret of the atom bomb and place our nation's survival in jeopardy. And I can say without fear of contradiction, that is a total lie, and it has been proven as a total lie. And we'd be happy to go into details if your listeners and viewers are interested.
Were Julius and Ethel members of the Communist Party?
Yes, they were definitely members of the Communist Party.
And was that illegal at that time?
No.
Communist Party membership, I mean, it ended up going to the Supreme Court. It took years to, come to the final determination. But it was never declared an illegal party, although I know that in the state of Alabama, I believe one of the houses of the state, and perhaps it was even signed by the governor, passed a law criminalizing the Communist Party and even imposing the death penalty for members of the Communist Party.
In 2008, In 2008, a documentary came out, The Brother Who Sent the Rosenbergs to the Electric Chair. You're going to hear Robert Meeropol's voice.
My parents were arrested when I was 3. They were killed when I was 6. My name is Robert Meeropol, but I was born Robert Rosenberg. My parents, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, were executed after being convicted of conspiracy to commit espionage by the United States government on June 19, 1953. And shortly afterwards, the beginning of 1954, my brother Michael and I were adopted by Abel and Ann Meeropol, and we took their names.
Now, some other players, you've mentioned David Greenglass. Who were David and Ruth Greenglass to you?
Uncle and aunt.
What was their role in this situation?
They turned state's evidence, and in return, Ruth Greenglass was an unindicted co-conspirator, which meant at any time the government could arrest her, but they chose not to arrest her. She and David Greenglass testified against our parents. By the way, committed proven perjuries. We can prove that because David Greenglass himself admitted that when he was interviewed on 60 Minutes 2 in 2001. Perjuries that explicitly changed my mother from somebody who initially they said never participated to somebody who engaged in typing to further the conspiracy, which David Greenglass admitted later it was untrue. So that was them. They were the perjurers who put our parents in the electric chair.
Was Ethel close to her brother David, and were they part of your family growing up?
Well, I can't speak to how much of a part of the family they were when I grew up, because that had all sort of come to an end. But I know that when Ethel and David were growing up, Ethel was I think 8 years older than David, and took care of him. She was, he was her younger little brother who she called Doovie. So it was quite a betrayal on his part.
And he was in Los Alamos, correct?
Yeah.
And what was he doing there?
He was an Army machinist, and he worked on machining molds that were used to figure out how to create the shaped charges that triggered the atom bomb. So he worked on the molds that were experimentally used. But while there, he allegedly snooped around and learned stuff about how the triggering device of the bomb worked. And he ended up doing a diagram of it, which was kind of crude and had a lot of errors in it, but the government was able to pass it off as the secret of the atom bomb, even though it clearly wasn't.
Were David and Ruth Greenglass members of the Communist Party?
Don't think so, but they were certainly pro-communist, as we could tell from the letters that they wrote to each other. And David Greenglass referred to himself as a communist, and he once told his wife that he would raise the red flag in his army troop, because the people at Los Alamos later reported that he was a loudmouth communist.
Well, David Greenglass appeared on 60 Minutes several years ago. Here's a portion of that interview.
You haven't seen the Rosenberg children, the 2 boys, since the trial.
Mm-mm.
What would you say to them if they were here today?
I would say, I'm sorry that your parents are dead.
Would you also say, I'm sorry for the role I played?
No, I can't say that. That's not true. I had no idea they're going to give them the death sentence.
And you're sitting here today, a man with a clean conscience.
Absolutely. I sleep very well.
Have you ever visited Ethel's grave?
No. I don't visit graves.
Have you been haunted by it?
To some degree, yeah. But every time I'm haunted by it, I'll say something. My wife says, look, we're still alive. we have our kids, everything's okay, you know, so.
Michael Meeropol, what's your reaction to that?
I saw it live, and of course he's got to defend himself against his own memory. And, you know, I'm not a forgiving person. I hope he is haunted by it. I hope he was haunted by it till the day he died.
There are some other people who played a role in this. One of them was Morton Sobel. Who was he?
Well, Morton Sobel was a City College friend of my father's who worked as an engineer and was part of the group of people that my father helped organize to provide the Soviet Union with military-industrial information during World War II in the 1940s. And so he was connected in the conspiracy and was given a 30-year sentence. The judge said because he wasn't involved in atomic espionage, which is kind of interesting because one of the things we know is that from secret Russian material that ultimately got released by the National Security Agency in the 1990s, that Julius Rosenberg is quoted in there as being ignorant of the atomic bomb project. So it's very difficult to have someone be a master atomic spy if they're ignorant of the atomic bomb project, especially if this is material that the United States government verifies the authenticity of.
Future Secretary of State William Rogers.
William Rogers was at that time an assistant attorney general. I know where you're going with this. A New York Times reporter at one point interviewed Rogers very soon before Rogers died and said to the Rogers, you know, you must have succeeded, right? You convicted the Rosenbergs and you executed them. And Rogers said, well, we didn't want to execute them. We wanted them to talk. And so Rogers said, well, what? The reporter said, well, what went wrong? And Rogers said, referencing to my mother, she called our bluff.
And that's, you know, I want to add one thing to create more context for that. What we discover when we look more closely at the case is that there was the only evidence presented against our mother, Ethel, was oral testimony given by the Gringlasses. And we then found out when the grand jury minutes were released that the Gringlasses actually said one thing under oath to the grand jury and another thing under oath at trial. So you can't say contradictory things under oath unless you say, oh, you know, my memory has been refreshed and I remembered that wrong. You can't do that without explanation because one of them has to be a lie. And so we can prove that the only evidence given against our mother was evidence given by proven perjurers. And boy, that's a good starting point when you start realizing that the involvement of our mother was the entire purpose was to coerce my father into cooperating. It wasn't because she was guilty, it was because they could use her as a lever. And the word lever, I didn't make that lever word up. It's actually contained in an FBI file.
Let me elaborate on what Rob just said to mention the fact that our mother, initially, the government said, when my father was arrested, there is not enough evidence to indict her. And not only is there contradictory testimony between the grand jury and what David and Ruth said at the trial. But on 60 Minutes, you didn't play the clip where David said that he lied at the trial about my mother typing. He even says, I don't know if anybody did any typing. So the typing story, which is the only thing that the government charged my mother with doing, is a phony story. And so that's where Rogers's point comes in. The government was bluffing when they indicted her. They wanted her to confess and turn on my father. They wanted my father to confess and turn in his associates. And that's what Rogers meant when he said, she called our bluff.
Michael,
basically what they did is they took her as a hostage and they killed her.
Michael, and that's I do want to. I'm sorry for interrupting you, but what Michael says sparks more things that some people listening to this may wonder. How do we know all this? Why do we have all this information? Why can we quote from FBI files and Venona transcriptions and all this secret material? Well, it's because my brother and I made a decision very early on, and really we're talking 50 years ago now, in 1974, where we decided we were going to use the Freedom of Information Act, which had just been strengthened after the Watergate scandal, to get all the material that the government had released to the public. And even though this was a dangerous tactic because it was the prosecution's material, what if it proved that my parents were guilty? We took the position that no matter what came out, we would live with it. And that it was more important for the public to know what happened than for our particular position to be vindicated. And we've maintained that. Let the chips fall where they may. And they did fall. And some of them, were indicated that my father was guilty of non-atomic espionage. But most of the chips also indicated that Ethel Rosenberg wasn't involved.
In 1951, Roy Cohn sat down for an interview. Here's a little bit of what he had to say.
Do you think that our very active prosecution in the last year has helped to materially cripple the workings of the party?
I think it has helped immeasurably. I think that the work of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, work of the Department of Justice in jailing as many of these people as didn't run off and jump bail, and the new indictment and the prosecution of communist leaders in this district has been the worst blow the Communist Party has suffered. And I disagree most strongly with some people who say it doesn't do any good. I think if these people are made to understand that like any other criminals, when they violate our laws, they will be punished, that will have a strong deterrent effect. And I think that the death sentence imposed by Judge Irving R. Kaufman and the Adams spy trial had a very strong deterrent effect. I think it's been a very good year on the anti-communist front in this country.
Gentlemen, what was Roy Cohn's role in your parents' execution?
All right, I guess I'll jump in. Roy Cohn was an assistant prosecutor, so he actually was one of the prosecutors in the trial, and he conducted the direct examination of David Greenglass. And according to Greenglass's testimony before 60 Minutes, years later, it was Roy Cohn who came to him and said, look, your wife has remembered that Ethel Rosenberg, your sister, did the typing. So are you going to stick to your original story that you never even talked to her about it? Or what are you going to do? And David Greenglass immediately adopted Ruth Greenglass's testimony, which he later admitted was a lie, because the alternative, as Cohn presented it to him, was you're going to have to call your wife a liar if you stick to your old testimony. And as David Greenglass told 60 Minutes too, I sleep with my wife, not my sister.
Were you two interviewed by federal agents at any point?
No.
No, we never were. I later found out that when my adoptive parents, Abel and Ann Meeropol, moved to Hastings-on-Hudson, New York, and I started high school in the 9th grade there, that the an FBI agent visited the superintendent of schools and asked him to keep an eye on me as a 13 or 14-year-old. And the superintendent of schools, who was apparently a good guy and not afraid of the FBI, was outraged and threw the agent out of his office. And in fact, then he called two teachers in who he particularly trusted and told them to keep an eye on me to make sure that I didn't have any trouble. So what the FBI was trying to do actually backfired. And I had teachers in that school, I didn't even realize it, watching my back the entire time I was there.
So was FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover involved in this case?
Oh, absolutely, 100%. J. Edgar Hoover was privy to all the stuff that we have learned since, including the non-involvement of my mother. And that is the reason why, surprisingly, when the judge was soliciting, by the way, doing this secretly, recommendations on the sentence, Hoover is in writing opposing the death sentence for our mother.
And I think this is an indication. I mean, this is where we get to, further evidence of the lack of involvement of Ethel. And that is that in 1995, when the National Security Agency released the Venona transcriptions, which were records of supposed, records of between the Soviet consulate in New York, who were transmitting information back to Moscow. One of the things we discovered when all this material was decrypted and then released to the public was that the KGB gave all of its agents code names. Julius Rosenberg had a code name. David and Ruth Greenglass had a code name, but Ethel didn't have a code name. So, this is not rocket science. KGB gives all its agents code names. Ethel doesn't have a code name. Ethel's not a KGB agent. And one of the things that was really tantalizing about the release of this material in 1995 is that there was one fragment of a memo that accompanied this material in which the chief decryptor for the NSA wrote that Ethel Rosenberg wrote an analysis of why one of the decrypted files said Ethel Rosenberg doesn't work. And his analysis was, well, she doesn't work. That probably means that she didn't do espionage work. So you have this incredible convergence of both spy agencies on both sides of the Atlantic agreeing that Ethel wasn't an agent, which is truly remarkable. But the reason we have this is because we've spent so much time focusing on freedom of information and always advocating for the release of more material.
Robert, go ahead, Michael.
I should add that a couple of years ago, we made the decision that there probably is more stuff available from the NSA that has not been released. So we filed a new request, it's pending, with the NSA for materials specifically related to code names and our mother, and we're hoping that we'll get that information sooner rather than later.
Early 50s in the U.S., the Red Scare, Joseph McCarthy. People were afraid of communists. Did Joseph McCarthy, senator from Wisconsin, play a role?
Well, Joseph McCarthy
Go ahead, Robert.
Played a role in setting up the climate of the times. And of course, one of his aides was Roy Cohn. So Roy Cohn went from my parents' trial to being an aide to McCarthy, and then, of course, ultimately being a mentor for Donald Trump. McCarthy whether he specifically mentioned my parents' case, I've seen a lot of footage of McCarthy during that period, but I don't remember him actually doing that. Perhaps Michael has another memory.
Well, the only memory I have is very indirect, that the last few months of our parents' lives, word came to the people on the committee that Rob mentioned, Emily and Dave Ullman, that McCarthy let it be known that if Eisenhower granted clemency, he would not oppose it. And my supposition is because of the intervention of Pope Pius XII. McCarthy was a practicing Catholic, and he might have actually had a sense that mercy was appropriate. We don't know this. This is a very indirect and uncertain statement. But as far as I know, I agree with Rob. I don't believe he ever made any public statements about our parents, but I could be wrong.
Michael Meeropol, who were your parents' lawyers?
Guy named Emanuel Block, and his father, Alexander Block, and they had one young assistant, a woman named Gloria Agrin, who Robbie and I got to know very well later on. That was it. It was a very small boutique law firm, and there's no question that they were way over their heads in the defense. They worked very hard, and I, speaking for myself, adore Manny Block, his memory, the love that he had for our parents, and the fact that he made the brilliant choice to place Rob and me with Abel and Ann Meeropol, because he was the guardian of Rob and me after our parents were killed. So I have nothing but love for Manny Block, but he made some serious errors, and Rob, as a lawyer, I'm sure could do chapter and verse on it. Not sure it matters much at this point, because I don't think a combination of Clarence Darrow and F. Lee Bailey could have protected our parents given the temper of the times.
Robert?
Yeah, it was a conspiracy case, and in a conspiracy case where you basically just have oral evidence, the most important thing is the credibility of the witnesses. And given the McCarthy period, who was going to be believed? The government of the United States and other family members who said my parents were guilty, or my parents who, when they took the witness stand and were asked if they were members of the Communist Party, they took the Fifth Amendment. So given that, yes, Manny made a lot of mistakes, but unfortunately, I don't think those mistakes made a lot of difference. The only difference it made was that he didn't create as good a record as he could have created, given how many times the trial judge intervened in the case and essentially acted as a second prosecutor. Well, that's enough.
What about Judge Irving Kaufman? Robert Meeropol.
Irving Kaufman was very
I'm going to answer that because he called on me, Michael. Judge Irving Kaufman was the youngest judge on the federal bench. He was very ambitious, and he wanted to be appointed to this, and he used his connection, if you believe Roy Cohn and what's been written about him, with Roy Cohn to get appointed to this trial. And then during the trial, he communicated secretly with Roy Cohn, and after the trial, as the FBI files indicated, he even attempted to intervene in the appellate process. So you have a judge. I also believe, and I can't prove this, but it looks to me like from all my research that the Venona transcriptions in which it was shown that Julius Rosenberg was involved in trying to help the Soviet Union defeat the Nazis, that the judge was provided snippets of that information from the NSA through the FBI, so that Judge Kaufman actually got what lawyers call extrajudicial information about my parents so that he was basically able to conclude that they were guilty before the trial even began. So the entire trial was actually a farce that Judge Irving Kaufman participated in. And of course, he went on to be elevated and awarded for, and even, now it's come out, the secret communications he had with the prosecution have sort of tarnished his legacy. But, he acted as a prosecutor. And one of the things that's unfortunate about our judicial system is all too often judges think that because they administer the law, they're actually above it.
There was quite a bit of world reaction to your parents' execution. Pablo Picasso, Albert Einstein, Diego Rivera, Jean-Paul Sartre called it a legal lynching, and W.E.B. Du Bois wrote a poem. Here's part of it. From floods of wrath, avenging God, pour down thy curse on us, the murderers who crucify the Jews. O blood-stained nations, stretch out your hands, cover them, judges, with your gory gowns. Come, lawyers, in your sheets of shame, proud pardoners of thugs and thieves. Gentlemen, was there a tinge of anti-Semitism in your parents' execution, do you think?
I do. I don't think they were arrested because they were Jews. They were arrested because they were communists, and my father was arrested because he had committed espionage. But I think two things happened. First of all, there was no way that a Jewish judge was not going to sentence them to death. And this is not me talking. This is the editors of a whole bunch of Jewish newspapers who, believing my parents were guilty, felt that the judge had been guilty himself of what they called a Jewish complex in sentencing them to death. But even more important, it gave the anti-Semites a field day, because they could say, see, Jews are dangerous. Jews are likely to be communists, and communists are likely to be spies, and spies are likely to be traitors. So it gave the anti-Semites a great lift. But I don't think they were arrested because they were Jews.
Robert,
I think it was the combination of both things, anti-Semitism and anti-communism, and both of them were quite significant.
Robert Meeropol, you both went off the radar after this for quite a while. You became Meeropols and resurfaced in the 1970s. Was that a conscious decision?
Well, not entirely. I mean, it was a conscious decision, but it wasn't one that was taken without a big push. And what I mean by that is that there was a famous trial lawyer named Louis Nizer who wrote a book called The Implosion Conspiracy. And at the end of the book, he talked about, he thought he was praising my brother and me by talking about how we become successful grown-ups who had professions, and the whole tone of how he ended the book was that we had rejected our parents and we were successful because we denied who they were and we did not have a positive connection to them. And that forced us, that plus the fact that he published copyrighted letters that we inherited the copyright to of our parents' correspondence, those two things put us in the position of saying, well, are we going to allow these lies to stand, or are we going to take legal action? And so we sued him. And of course, in the process of suing him, we went public. So, while I might like to say I'm this great crusader who went charging out to clear my parents' name, to some degree, I backed into it. But of course, once we began this process, we have stuck to it for the last 50 years.
Michael Meeropol, you ended up becoming Meeropols. Who were Abel and Ann Meeropol, and what was your path to get to their house?
Well, the last part was somebody who knew Manny Block very well and knew them told Manny Block they would be perfect. They were left-wingers. In fact, My father was definitely a member of the Communist Party. We didn't learn that till much later. They were very, very artistic. My mother had been a school teacher and worked in the field of drama with teenagers and adults. My father had been a high school English teacher who then became a full-time writer, and his two most successful pieces of writing was the film, the song Strange Fruit and the song The House I Live In. And he remained so proud of Strange Fruit his entire life. So they were wonderful people. I mean, we couldn't have done better. And I say, in my opinion, they saved our lives by giving us incredibly normal childhoods.
But you started off with your maternal grandmother, Hebrew Children's Home, etc., correct?
Oh yeah, no, we went through the mill. From the time our mother was arrested till we moved in with the Meeropols, we were back and forth with a lot of different places. The time with our maternal grandmother was awful because she was roundly criticizing our parents the whole time we lived with her. Then we were in a children's shelter. And then finally we were with the Rosenberg side of the family and with family friends from June of 1951 till December of 1953 when we first met Anne and Abel Meeropol.
At the home of W.E.B. Du Bois's house. And I must say that that poem was really, that you read, was quite powerful. I had never heard it before.
Robert Meeropol, when did you begin efforts to look into your parents' case?
Well, as we really started with our Freedom of Information Action in 1974. And I remember that year in particular because one of the things that a friend of mine said, well, you know, the Rosenberg case is 21 years old. It's come of age. It's time to reopen it. And so, but in terms of understanding the case, and I went back to law school. I went to law school in my 30s. I was originally trained in social science and in anthropology. And when I went back to law school, that's when I really restudied the case with the eyes of a law student. And that's, you know, that's when I really, and the process of sort of, well, let's try to figure out exactly what went on. And that's, you know, that's one of the things, as we're personally involved in this, but as our parents' children, we want to find out what really happened. We don't want to cover up anything. And that's why we've constantly pushed this freedom of information. And that's why the American public probably knows more about the internal aspects of the creation of my parents' prosecution than they do about any other major case. And so I'm quite proud of that.
Want to show some video from December of 2016? Here it is.
63 years ago, I delivered a short letter to President Eisenhower at these gates. Today, after over 40 years of research and struggle, we are sharing with President Obama the fruits of that struggle. And once again, asking for presidential action.
My brother, with the letter he presented to the White House at this spot in June 1953, gave President Eisenhower the chance to pass that test. Eisenhower failed it, but we hope President Obama will demonstrate his compassion and decency and pass that test now.
Michael Meeropol, what were we watching?
Rob had come up with the idea probably about 4 years earlier that based on the information we had, there were grounds for a declaration of exoneration of our parents. And I agreed with him, and we worked on a campaign which ultimately collected 60,000 signatures. We modeled it on what the governor of Massachusetts did in the Sacco and Vanzetti case in 1977, issued a proclamation of innocence. It's not a pardon. A pardon admits guilt, But we asked Obama to look at the record, which we presented to him in voluminous detail, that proves that our mother was wrongfully convicted based on perjured testimony, and therefore the presumption of innocence should be retained. And Obama should have said, as far as the United States government is concerned, Ethel Rosenberg is exonerated. Unfortunately, we never got an answer from him. We don't even know if he read our materials, but he certainly should have, because we made a hell of a case.
Robert Meeropol, early in this program, you mentioned that this was an exciting time for the Ethel Rosenberg case. Why?
Well, because it's like for the last 50 years almost, though probably more like 40 or 35, ever since I came up with the idea at the end of law school, which was like around the early 1990s. I graduated law school in 85, but after that, came up with the idea of separating my mother's case from my father's case, because I realized as a new lawyer that the evidence presented against her was so weak that even if you believed every word of it, it would be hard to believe that someone would be executed for typing, because that's what she was executed for if you believe the green glass testimony. So I began working on this idea of separating my mother's case from my father's case. And as the years went on, it's like we were putting together a big jigsaw puzzle. And there were these pieces that fell into place. The green glasses, the weak evidence to begin with, then finding in the 1970s the FBI memos that said there was not a sufficient evidence against Ethel even to indict her, but we want to indict her and give her a stiff sentence so we can use her as a lever against her husband. And then when the Venona transcriptions came out and we found out that there was that she wasn't given a code name. And then when the NSA memo showed that, well, she probably didn't do espionage work, it's like we put all these pieces together, and the more pieces of a jigsaw puzzle you put together, the easier it is to see what's missing. And what we realized what's missing, and I wish I had thought of it sooner, was after Obama did nothing. He didn't, why he did nothing, we may never know. He didn't turn down our request, but he left office without acting on it. And we started thinking about, well, Biden, when he was elected, let's see if we can restart this campaign. And then the war in Ukraine happened. And we realized how difficult it would be for an administration that was supporting Ukraine against Russian aggression to then go out and issue a proclamation that in effect would exonerate someone who was convicted of spying for the Russians. That we had such powerful headwinds against us, we had to do something more, even though our case was so strong. So that's when we asked the NSA to declassify and release the material still under their control. We figured, based upon what had already been released, that the chief decryptor had written more memos at greater length about Ethel, and that the NSA still had those memos. And so we pressed them to declassify material that they had that was approaching 75 years old. And our lawyer, who was knowledgeable and persistent, actually got an NSA official to admit to him on the phone that there were 88 documents still in their possession that were under their control. And we surmise that there's a file in there that says Ethel Rosenberg was not a spy. And when that file gets released, the puzzle will finally be complete, and we'll be able to show the American public that the U.S. government knew Ethel Rosenberg was not a spy, used her as a hostage, and executed her because she called their bluff. That once we can do that, that is really exciting, and that's. But while the NSA has said it is in favor of more openness, and that's been a real push because there's been so much overclassification, even though the NSA has said that, well, for whatever reason, 2 years have gone by since we made this request, and we still don't have this material. So that is, but any day it could happen. And we're going to continue to press for it any way that we can. I want to take the opportunity to thank the office of my Congressman, Jim McGovern. They have produced a letter urging this action, and we are working on it on a regular basis, and we're not sprinters. We're on a marathon. We've been doing this for 50 years. I'm 77, my brother's 81. We feel our time is limited, and so we're going to keep up the pressure for as long as we can.
Michael Meeropol, have you ever considered taking back the Rosenberg name?
We did. I certainly did when I was much younger. And when Robbie turned 21, I thought, well, maybe. And my wife and I discussed it, and we thought it would be artificial. And when we went out in public, we sort of made a joke. We said, well, if we wanted to be anonymous, we could change our name back to Rosenberg, because there are thousands of Rosenbergs in phone books all over the country. We are Michael and Robert Meeropol, the sons of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, and everybody knows that. And I want to elaborate on what Rob just said. It's very important. We have very strong suspicions as to what are in those 88 documents. But of course, until they're released, we can only say this is what we believe. Once it's released, and if we are right, we expect this to be a blockbuster. So we're really hoping that the members of Congress who are putting the pressure on, and our lawyers, and the NSA's own belief in transparency will ultimately prevail. And if we are right, it's going to blow the lid off it.
And we're willing to deal with the fact that we could be wrong. Yeah, and we'll accept whatever comes out. And that's the important point. It's not, it's very powerful for us personally. But from the American point of view, the American public deserves to know what was done in their name. And freedom of information is one of the cornerstones of democracy. And it is absolutely essential to demonstrate what happens when judicial procedures are misused. When that happens, everybody is threatened. It's not just the Rosenbergs. So while the Rosenberg case is approaching 75 years old, it is just as contemporary as it was 75 years ago.
Gentlemen, if viewers want to get in touch with you, do you maintain a website with all this information that you've been sharing in this interview?
Well, I would direct people to the website of the Rosenberg Fund for Children, which is a public foundation that I founded in 1990 that provides for the educational and emotional needs of the children of targeted activists in the United States. And if you go to their website, it's a real easy address, www.rfc.org, you will find all sorts of information about the work of the RFC, but also about the Rosenberg case.
Michael Meeropol, does this ever not feel real to you?
No, it's been real from the time we as adults chose to claim our parents and demand the results of the government and work on reopening. It's been very real, and it's been very important to us. And I'm 4 years older than my brother. So, actuarially, I don't have as much time as he does. It's time for the United States government to own up, release the stuff.
Michael Meeropol, on your right, was 10 years old in 1953 when his parents, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, were executed. Robert, on your left, was 6 years old Gentlemen, thanks for being on Q&A with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks for joining us on this Q&A podcast. Next week, we talk with Dr. Francis Collins, the former head of the National Institutes of Health. His new book is The Road to Wisdom, and it looks at the intersection and friction between science and faith.